Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about Prot Paladin talent builds. And I get questions about this all the time. People want to know what the best spec is, but there's a lot of factors that go into figuring out which spec is going to be the right one for you. There's not really a one size fits all spec, so I'm going to be going over all the main Prot Paladin specs and also just some of the general talents. I'll be touching on those individually. So the most important thing that's going to determine what spec you want to go is going to be the role you play in your raid. So a main tank in a guild is probably going to want a little bit different spec than an off tank. And also it's going to depend on your raid group and also your specific group that you're usually in. So Prot Paladins can slot into a lot of different groups really easily. We benefit from tons of different buffs. So I think it's best if Prot Paladins just go into whatever group is kind of left over after all the DPS have their ideal group. So you can be in a lot of different groups. You might be in like an elemental shaman 3 warlock group. You might be in a melee group. You might be in like a healer group where you have like a resto shaman dropping totems for you, a holy pally giving you devo aura, a tree druid giving you their healing buff. So paladins are pretty versatile. We can go in a lot of different groups. But which group you're in is going to determine kind of the spec you want to go. So that's going to be a little bit different for everybody. So first off, let's talk about some terminology really quick, just so we're on the same page and understanding what we're talking about. So when I say external sanc, I'm just talking about somebody else is providing sanctity aura for you. That means you don't need to actually spec for it yourself. Somebody else in your group that you're normally with is going to give it to you. This is going to be another prot pally, a ret pally, or a holy pally. And just a side note, the ret pally generally isn't going to want to be in your group, but if you're in like the melee group and that's just how things work out, let's say you run like one enhancement shaman, one ret pally, one fury warrior or arms warrior, and one rogue, something like that, and you can slot in there no problem, you don't have any other melee, then that works out pretty well. But some guilds have a full melee group already, so you would have to take a melee out of the melee group or move the ret pally into a different group that they don't necessarily want to be in, where they're not getting battle shout, they might not be getting wind fury, that kind of stuff. So kind of depends on your specific raid, but in general, rets aren't really going to want to be in your group unless you're joining the melee group. So you should generally just provide your own Sanc Aura, but Holy Pallies can also provide it for you. That's another option. And if you do run two Prot Pallies, then one of you can go Sanc and the other one can go for a different spec. So we also need to talk about Snap Threat and Sustained Threat. So Snap Threat is going to be your short-term threat. That's going to be things like Judgment of Righteousness, Avenger's Shield, Exorcism. These are going to be abilities that give you a ton of threat right away, and then they have a cooldown and they aren't generating any more threat for you during that time. So Sustained Threat is going to be your long-term threat. That's going to be generally things like Consecration, Seal of Righteousness, Blessing of Sanctuary, Holy Shield, things that are constantly generating threat for you, and really just the big picture of all your threat that is after the initial pull. Your snap threat is going to be all your initial stuff that you do right on the pull, but your sustained threat is what's going to help you keep threat after you pop everything on the initial pull. So let's look at some individual talents here and kind of go over them real quick. So I see a lot of people drop points in precision to get other stuff. This is a really good talent. You really shouldn't be dropping any points in this generally. I would pretty much always go 3 out of 3 on that. Shield specialization, the value of this really depends on what you're fighting. Against something like Hyjal Trash, this is going to be extremely valuable. Against something like main tanking Illidan, this is going to be not very valuable at all. And just to go over shield block really quick, the way it works, it applies after all your damage reduction. So if you have, let's say, 65% total damage reduction between your armor and improved Righteous Fury, then let's say a mob hits you for 1,000 damage after that damage reduction. Then you have 500 shield block. You're just gonna take 500 damage off that 1,000 damage that the mob is hitting you for after your damage reductions. So your shield block is gonna reduce the remaining damage by 50%. So in a case like that, shield block's extremely strong. But let's say a mob's hitting you for 5,000, then it's only going to reduce their remaining damage by 10%. So you can see shield block's value can vary wildly between what you're fighting. So that's something to consider when you're deciding whether you want shield specialization or not. Also, tier 5 gear has a lot of really good pieces that have shield block on it, but in tier 6, there's a lot less pieces that you're generally going to be using that do have shield block. So the value of shield specialization is going to decrease a bit when you get more tier 6 gear and start replacing your tier 5 gear. I think early on this is a really awesome talent for progression because it's going to help your guild a lot in Hyjal, because you're going to be fighting a ton of trash, and BT you're going to also be fighting a ton of trash. So I think this is a really good talent early on during progression until you get everything on farm. Anticipation is kind of an interesting talent because once we reach tier 6, it's really easy to get enough defense that you can just drop points in anticipation because you're going to have so much gear that defense isn't really going to be too much of an issue. So you can drop a point or two in anticipation, put in something else. Can put more points into like Reckoning, for example, or shield specialization, kind of depends what your build's looking like. And Blessing of Kings, this one, you can drop it. This is going to depend on your specific raid. If you have somebody else bringing Blessing of Kings, there's not really any reason for you to have it. So like in my raid, our ret does all our kings buffs. So I just drop kings and pick up something else with that point. Either usually put an extra point in shield spec or reckoning with that. And let's look at reckoning here. So reckoning is a really good threat ability, but it is going to increase the damage you take by a little bit. This is because of a mechanic called Parry Haste. If you aren't familiar with that, basically when a mob parries you, you're going to reduce its swing timer by 40% of the total swing timer. But that can't go below 20% of their swing timer. So let's look at an example of that. So let's say a mob has a 1 second swing timer and the mob parries you. You're gonna reduce its swing timer by 40%. So in this case, 0.4 seconds of the total swing timer. And so if that mob is less than 0.6 seconds from getting a swing off, then you won't get the full 0.4 second reduction on that. So if the mob is at 0.5 seconds in their swing timer, you would subtract 0.4, but that would take it below 20% of its total swing timer, which would be 0.2 seconds. So in that case, you would only get 0.3 seconds on the Parry Haste increase in attack speed. So, and this can lead to a lot more damage, and really it's going to increase your burst damage taken, which is your most common time you're going to be dying, is when you take extra burst damage, lots of damage in quick succession. So that is something to consider when you're picking up Reckoning. Reckoning also is a lot better if you're getting Wind Fury Totem, because the extra attacks from Reckoning are going to proc Wind Fury attacks. So you're going to get a little bit of extra value there. Let's look at Ardent Defender. So This talent has its place, but most people don't get it because of one major issue, and we call that leapfrogging. So if a mob just hits you really hard and you aren't in the damage threshold range to get the damage reduction from this talent, then a mob can just completely bypass it. So if you're at like 36% HP, mob hits you for 7k, then you just die. You don't get the damage reduction from this talent. So that's just 5 wasted talent points right there. So the value of this is a little bit hit or miss because it relies on you actually being below 35% HP when damage occurs to actually have an effect. So the use of this is pretty limited. Generally, you're not really going to want this talent. Let's take a look over at the ret tree. So Vindication is kind of an interesting talent because against some mobs, it will reduce their max HP. So per point, it will reduce their max HP by about 2.3% per point. So if you had full 3 points in it, it would reduce their max HP by about 7%. But this will only be effective if you proc this when the mob is higher than that percent. So if they're above 93%, if you have 7 points in, then you'll get some value out of it. So this is kind of better on like an off tank, but the value is also a little bit limited, especially when you're dealing with lots of AOE situations like we're going to be in Hyjal, where all the mobs in a pack are immediately pretty much below that threshold. So if you proc to this on a mob at 100% HP, you would effectively do 7% of their health because you would reduce their max HP by 7%. You had full points in this. So that's the value of this, but I don't think it's super worth it, especially with the meta we're probably entering with BT and Hyjal, where it's just lots of AoE damage. You're not often, I don't think, going to get much value out of this. So let's look at some specific talent builds now. The first one we're going to look at, this is the 0-40-21 spec. This is like your standard Sanc Aura spec. So this is going to be a build where you need to provide your own Sanc Aura. And there's a few versatile points in this. So in the one I like to run, I've been using this for most of tier 5 now. Basically, I get 3 points in Reckoning. These 3 points can go into Shield Spec, depending on what you like. You, at this point, will get around 120 plus extra block value going 3 points in Shield Spec, which can be really nice against trash. And you can also just do like 2 points in Shield Spec, 1 point in Kings if you do need to provide Kings for your raid. And over here in Ret, if you need to provide Imp Seal of the Crusader for your raid, generally this is going to be provided by the Ret, but if you don't have a Ret in your raid, then what you can do, drop these 2 points in Conviction, put them in Imp Seal of the Crusader, and I would also drop 1 point in Pursuit of Justice to round that out, get the full 3 points in there. And this build is a really nice all-around build. You can main tank with this, off tank with this. Your threat's going to be really good. Your snap threat isn't going to be as high as other builds since you are missing Avenger's Shield. However, in tier 6, we get to use Exorcism on most things. So that really solves your snap threat issue. And before tier 6, you're pretty reliant on like Judgment of Righteousness for snap threat or super sapper charges, things like that. But in tier 6, you're going to be able to Exorcism and Judgment of Righteousness right off the bat. So your snap threat's pretty good. And your sustain threat is really strong with this. Your AoE threat's really good because you're going to have Crusade. And if you have Reckoning, your threat's going to be pretty awesome because that's frequently up when you have 3 points in it. So the next build we're going to look at is the 03823 build. This is the Imp Sanc Aura build. And what Imp Sanc Aura does is it increases the damage of everybody affected by your Sanc Aura by 2%. So this is more for if you're slotting into like a caster group. I wouldn't use this if you're generally in like a healer group with like Resto Shaman, Holy Pally, Resto Druid, that kind of group. This is primarily for when you're in a DPS group. So if you don't have a ret in your raid, then potentially you could be in the melee group. This would be good for that. More often you might be in like a caster group with like an Ellie Shaman, a couple warlocks, or a few mages, Shadow Priests, whatever. So if you slot into a full DPS group like that, this is a really awesome build. You're going to increase all of their damage by 2%. It's also going to give you 2% more damage. And that does come at the cost of 2 points in combat expertise. So you're going to lose 4% stam. This basically equates to 400 to 500 max HP, depending on what gear you're wearing. That's fully raid buffed. But you can overcome that HP loss with more gear. So as you get lots of gear in a tier, and you start to kind of over gear it, this is a build you can definitely look at. And you can also just overcome this HP loss with an extra stam trinket. So the way you can think about this is that your second trinket slot is essentially 2% more damage to you and your whole group. So that's a pretty awesome trinket. And this is definitely a solid build that you can look at, especially late in the tier. This build is very capable of off tanking, and it is also capable of main tanking too with enough gear. And off tank would definitely be the role that I would recommend for this one, but either one will work. So let's look at the next build. So this is the 10-41-10 build. So this is going to be a build where somebody else is providing Sanc Aura for you. So you have an external Sanc. So with this build, the main benefits of this over the other builds, of course, you have to pretty much run the other builds if you don't have an external Sanc, but the main advantage you're going to get from this build, you're going to get Avenger Shield, so that's really going to increase your snap threat, and you're also going to get improved Seal of Righteousness. This is going to increase both your sustained threat and your snap threat, so it's going to increase Judgment of Righteousness damage by 15%, that's more snap threat, and it's going to also increase your Seal of Righteousness damage by 15%. So that's really awesome for sustained threat. And when you have the 2-piece tier 4 bonus, that's going to be multiplicative with this. So you're going to get a total of 26.5% extra damage on Seal of Righteousness if you have the 2-piece tier 4 and improved Seal of Righteousness. The value of this talent is going to go down a little bit in tier 6 when you do replace that tier 4, but it is still pretty strong. One thing to note is that this build does not get improved judgment. So you're going to have the longer judgment cooldown, which is definitely something to consider because we get the Ashtongue Talisman of Zeal in tier 6, and that's a 50% proc chance off judgment. So if your judgment has a longer cooldown, that's going to decrease the uptime of your Ashtongue Talisman. So this build is really strong with an external Sanc in tier 5, but it is going to lose a bit of value in tier 6. Also, since most things you can use Exorcism on, Avenger Shield loses relative value over the other builds, just because all builds are going to be able to have higher snap threat with Exorcism, but Avenger Shield is still really awesome to have. So this is a great option, primarily for a main tank, but could be an off tank too. So the next build we're going to look at is the 04318 build. This is the Crusade build, and this also relies on an external Sanc. So with this build, the main thing you're going for over the SOR build is Crusade. That's going to increase your damage against demons, undead, humanoids, and elementals by 3%. And in tier 6, that's basically all you fight. So it's pretty much just a flat 3% damage increase. So that's pretty great to have, and that of course applies to trash. Imp SoR isn't really going to help you as much on trash, like Hegel trash, where there's like 12 plus mobs. So Crusade's a pretty awesome talent, and with this build you also get Imp Judgment, and like we talked about before, that's going to be pretty useful for increasing the uptime on your Ash-Tongue Talisman of Zeal if you're using that trinket. And this build also gets 5 points in Reckoning, so that's going to increase your single target threat by quite a lot, but as we talked about before with Parry Haste, it will also increase the damage you take and increase the chance of getting gibbed. Alright, next we've got the 04912 build. This is the Deep Prot build. So this build is just all in on survivability basically. It gets all the talents that help you live longer, and I generally wouldn't recommend this build. This is kind of something you would only bring out if your survivability is the sole thing keeping your guild from killing a boss. You could use this during progression. Like a fight like Illidan might be something you could use it on, but in general, this would be a very short-term build that you would only use in specific circumstances. So with this build, you're getting Ardent Defender, you're getting Spell Warding, full points in Shield Spec, you're getting anything that's going to help you live. You can run this build without an external Sanc if you really need to. For something like Illidan, you're going to get a little extra threat from Holy Shield because he attacks super fast, and you can also Exorcism Illidan. So those can potentially make up for some of the threat loss from not having Sanc. In general, you pretty much always want to have Sanc. That would be like a really fringe scenario where your survivability is the only thing keeping your guild from killing Illidan, and you just want to go all in on survivability to increase the chance of you living. But in general, this is not a spec you're generally going to use, but it's something to have in your back pocket in case your survivability is the only thing your guild's missing. Alright, so the last build we're going to talk about is the 03130 build. This is the Vengeance build, and this build's mainly an AOE farming build. You can use it for parsing too. It's kind of a meme build. And the main talent here is Vengeance. So this is going to increase your physical and holy damage by 5% per stack, stacks up to 3 times every time you get a critical strike with a weapon, spell, or ability. So 15% total damage, really awesome for farming, really awesome for parsing. One thing to note for farming is you can throw on a forced reactive disc, and that's an engineering shield that when you block, it shoots out a bunch of lightning. Those are all considered spells, so any of them that crit will give you stacks of vengeance. So for AoE farming, that's awesome. You throw it on, you have tons of stuff attacking you. You're most likely going to crit stuff pretty quickly, get a full stack of vengeance. So you can start pretty much any AoE farm with a full stack of vengeance. Makes your kill times way quicker, speeds up your farming. And as far as using this build in a raid, it has very, very low survivability. This is really, as I said, just a meme parsing build. So you lose your points in Sacred Duty, you lose your points in combat expertise, so your max HP is going to be significantly lower, and you lose 2 points in Improved Holy Shield, so your Holy Shield's only going to have 4 charges, and it's going to do less damage. So you lose a lot. All this can really tank is like Rage Winter Chill, Void Reaver, those kinds of things. So in general, I would stay away from this. If 1 week you feel like you want to get a really big parse, this is something you can do. I personally don't bother with this unless I'm AoE farming. That's all I use this build for. But whatever's fun for you, go ahead. For AOE farming, you would want to drop the 3 points in precision, put them in shield specialization, because you're going to be hit capped when you're fighting mobs in Strat and Scullo because they're so low level. And shield block is extremely valuable in big AOE farms since you're fighting lots of stuff that hits you for small amounts of damage. And also for AOE farming, you would want to drop 1 point in improved judgment, put that over in pursuit of justice. That's just going to increase your farm time or farm speed because there's a lot of running around, and this is going to let you run around faster. Those are all the main Prot Paladin talent builds. Hopefully it's a little more clear now when you kind of want to use each one. If you guys have any questions, always feel free to ask. Happy to answer those anytime. I hope this video helps you out, and I'll see you in the next one.